Welcome back to the Inner Circle Boardroom. Our guest for today is Chris. Where I want to start off is quite simply by grounding this conversation in decisions that actually behave inside organizations. Clearly, you've sat across quite a few different environments over your career as CFO, from large corporations, working on acquisitions and scaling businesses, integrations through to exits. I think what's interesting across all those environments is that decisions tend to get described as quite rational or structured and almost clean in hindsight. But when you're actually inside those boardrooms, I know it feels very different in that there's more pressure in terms of interpretation, timing, risk, and different incentives. So often there's different versions of reality play out in real time. So where I thought we could start was with something quite simple, in that inside large enterprise boardroom environments, what typically is driving the outcomes and the rational thinking in your experience?
In the large corporate setting, and I'll go back to Motorola, Dell, and then I can also speak to Dell Alienware, because those would all be classified as large enterprise. It's very different than what you would see in a smaller business or a small growing to large business, and it's massively different. So in other words, when you are sitting in a boardroom for a company like Dell, let's say, and even Motorola, you're normally talking about a situation where you've got a thriving enterprise with a very heavy balance sheet, lots of cash. So the relativity of an urgent crisis is very different, or the relativity of a decision is also very relatively different. As an example, if you're sitting at Motorola, let's launch internet connectivity and services. That's not going to change the company's cellular business, which is driving 90% of the revenue of the company at that moment in time. What it's going to do is it's going to require capital from the mothership. It's going to require focus. It's going to require entrepreneurial permission, if you want to call it that. And that's true of all the big companies. The other thing I would say is the dynamic is very different as well, because it's PowerPoints, it's a room full of people. All of them are high executive titles, seasoned folks for the most part. So there's going to be a very broad-based dialogue, generally speaking. And if the CEO happens to be in the room at that moment during the dialogue, that will be the ultimate voice. But that CEO in that big company is going to be listening. It's going to be letting the leadership team kind of flesh it out. In companies like Dell, what you would see is start with the beginning, tell me what you want, and then we'll discuss all the details around it. That's very, very different than the smaller companies. The big company environment, what I would say is it's much more corporate, it's much more polished, it's much more polite even, and it's less emotional, it's less primal, I guess you would say, which is very different. It's what we'd call civilized, right? And if there's going to be a debate, it happens, but it's pretty rare in that big enterprise setting that you're going to see people wearing it on their sleeve and slinging emotions across the room. Very rare.
I could relate to that in that it's a bit more political, if that's the right word to use. As you pointed out, if the CEO is there, maybe even external advisors or investors. I suppose where I was going with that was, in your view, where does the real influence really sit when decisions are being shaped? And what are some of the pressure points that you've seen show up in those conversations?
I think it really depends on the type of issue. If it's a purely financial issue, the reality in a big company is you're probably never going to see the CEO. What will happen is you're going to live in the CFO's playground with all of the treasurer and the controllers and the business leads that need to make influence. And you're going to make a financial decision that the CFO is then going to probably take in a more private setting. If it's a market decision or a strategic decision, that's very different. Then you're going to have all the stakeholders in the room. And in reality, in all of these big companies, everybody's kind of playing up to, if not the CEO, then the CEO's office, because that is where the decision is being made. Clearly, that's where the decision is being made. And often, or most times, there are parameters around guidance and judgment that everybody knows about. As you said, it's more political. It's also more framed up. There are fancy words around the processes that are in place, but everything is funneling towards that CEO. And potentially, if it's big enough, it would go out to the investors, it would go out through the board, it would go out through the investor relations folks, the CFO, to the market if there's a bit of selling that needs to take place. If it's that big of a situation, which I've been involved in those, but it's still, at the end of the day, the CEO is not going to take forward anything that he or she doesn't want to be a proponent of. It's just, it will end there. And that's my experience.
So what do you think an outsider who's not been in that ecosystem doesn't really quite understand or underestimates about those environments?
In two big companies, I was involved with strategic initiatives, whether it was let's go launch internet connectivity services, whether it was we should be this e-commerce marketplace, for the whole world. I've been part of those groups of people that, worked as kind of entrepreneurial skunk work teams, and I was the financial lead to those initiatives. I think the biggest thing that people on the outside should understand is that there's a lot of inertia that you're up against in that setting, in that boardroom setting. You've got people that are senior executive level, C-level folks in the room that are now being measured on 90-day cycles to the outside market. They don't really oftentimes have the bandwidth or the kind of payload to deal with some of these issues. So first of all, it's very much like Guy Kawasaki, like The Art of the Start, where an investor goes into a row of, of VCs or PE folks, and you got 5 minutes to make your case. It's not that much different in the big corporate setting. And oftentimes what happens is there are so many big high level initiatives going on that you're kind of fighting. Like I said, the word would be inertia. And what's the feeling of that? The feeling of that is you're very convinced and emotionally attached to this thing that is going to change the landscape. And rightfully, the people that you're talking to are looking at this and saying, that's really interesting, but we don't have time for this. It's not part of our core mission. And I've run into that across 3 or 4 different companies. And that tends to be why companies can disappear off the face of the planet as well, because these big companies get so enamored with, bought into, beholden to this 90-day outside process that you're this foreign object that just entered the room on the petri dish. And even though you have the best possible outcome in your heart and in your analytics, you're still viewed as kind of this outside thing. It's true. And that would be my impression of the enterprise level for some of these things. The other thing, Kay, you run up against is this thing called the annual planning cycle and the budgets, right? So being in the finance arena and being partnered with a business owner, the other thing that ends up happening at a highest level is they abdicate responsibility and they say, look, the net of it is we've already sold the budget. We've sold all of our numbers to the external market. Perhaps you're coming in late to the game on this initiative or this strategic idea. So then what ends up, this is a very common. Go negotiate with your peers and your counterparts. If you can dislodge budget, if you can dislodge resources, all those things. So it could be capital, it could be headcount, whatever it is. And you can come back to us and tell us that you're not going to put a ripple in the pond. Go for it. So then what ends up happening is now you're on it's almost like a marketing campaign. And you're trying to now work with leaders, sometimes across the globe, for your quote unquote pet project or the capital allocation. That's how it works in the big companies. Oftentimes what happens is everybody is already stretched as far as they feel like they can go. Or to your point about politics, they're saying, well, if I give you this budget, I lose the budget. And if I lose the budget this year, I lose the budget next year. So I can't give you anything. You do find scenarios where this works, but it takes an exhausting amount of energy sometimes. I call it pushing the rope up the hill.
We've spoken a bit about where some of the stress testing is within boardrooms. In your opinion, where do you actually see what actually people start to see and do differently when decisions are under pressure?
The interesting answer is maybe not the one you're going to expect now, but there is a culture tied to acquirer mentality. So, for example, when I was involved with the Alienware acquisition, I was involved after it had been decided. So I was involved on the execution side. However, at that moment in time, unlike today, but at that time, Dell's kind of MA mindset was very, very different than it is today. I mean, since then, Dell has bought EMC and done massive acquisitions. So, what I would say is the biggest thing is, are you running in a company where there's no culture for acquisition, where there's no culture for going off and recreating the company, because capital flows that way, right? So in the big companies, if there's no appetite for going, and it comes down to what you just said, it comes down to political risk for leaders. And most leaders don't want to make a decision that's going to impact their standing, their paycheck, their equity, what have you, fill in the blanks. So the first thing is it comes down to culture, and then it comes down to not just words of support, but actual execution within this enterprise entity. And the best companies that I've been part of have actually carved out dollars and said, we're going to create these lily pads of opportunity, and we're going to fund them in the budget, and we're going to support these people with talent. There's another one, right? Because another one that happens is, sure, go try this, but then you end up with not necessarily the best players on the team, right? But that would be the big one, because if the culture doesn't support this notion, the capital won't follow.
In terms of acquisitions, I know you said already you walked into that when the decision had already been made. In your opinion, what was influencing the decision at that point?
If we're going to talk specifically about Alienware, you'd have to go back and look at the attraction of the brand. So Alienware was this iconic, viral, emotional brand. It was like the Harley Davidson brand of computing. I don't even think at that time there was anything close. There was nothing that was that unique and cool. And I mean, even the logo, the Alienware had, it was very attractive. We're going back couple decades. And this was back in the Steven era. At that time, there was a movement afoot about loosening up the Dell brand a little bit for the consumer side and trying to recast, again, that part of the business so that it was more hip, it was younger, and it played in this space of the gamer. If you wanted to make a play, of course, you could have spent a lot of time internally trying to recast one of the existing Dell brands, or you just go get the best one out there. It's like Audi buying Lamborghini.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, right? And so, yes, it's market penetration, but it's also IP. IP is just as big in my mind as market share, because it's IP and brand, creative brand.
What changes first in how decisions are being made? What became harder to do or easier?
Everything became harder. So to give you an idea, so United Technologies, Motorola, Dell Alienware, to something called Triad Retail Media, which was venture capital, just brand new acquisition from venture capital, HIG Growth, to a company that was at that time in 2010, when I became founding CFO, was doing tens of millions of dollars of revenue in this space called retail media, which nobody even understood. Everything was harder. The accounting was outsourced, number one. There had never been a board meeting. There had never been a third-party professional audit. In the company itself, there were no professional accounting staff at all. So, for example, like one of the first couple months that I was there, I went to one of the people on my team and I said, what's revenue this month? And the answer was, I'll get back to you. I got to go ask the CEO. It wasn't a totally out of bounds response, because the reason was it was as sold back at that time. And this person had to find out what actually got booked. So it was a matter of going into sales. Everything was siloed. We were in Tampa, Florida, and the accounting was being done in Michigan. So everything was harder. But having said that, everything was an opportunity. Everything was an opportunity to build an accounting team from scratch, to build financial planning and analysis from scratch, to build pricing from scratch. These things existed, but they existed in very non-orchestrated ways. Like within a team, there was somebody doing some analysis. So to answer your question, everything was harder.
Usually when I speak to somebody who pivots from a large enterprise corporation into a startup ecosystem, or a couple of million underway, I tend to find the biggest difference is that, having all the resources to hand to having to do everything. Literally.
I had to create a board meeting,
Yeah.
a package. I had to get through the first audit. I had to build a team. But I will say my background is perfect, because by the time I left, we were doing many hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, had an ERP in place, had a professional staff. I think we had moved to Oracle. We had built an ERP from order management all the way through billing, but it was a hard decision because you went from an environment where everything was buttoned up, everything was processed, everything was to an environment where nothing existed and everything had to be created. By the time we were done, though, you establish a multi-tens of $1 million line of credit so you can pay your partners in a given day. It worked. It was hard, though. On a personal level, it was extremely difficult. And as I've talked about a little bit on social media, LinkedIn, and things like that, I just happened to be going through a divorce at the same time I was doing this. So it was very difficult on a personal level, and the business was demanding every single drop of me. So that went on for the whole ride because we grew 45% as a 10-year CAGR. So we were doubling the company size every 2 years for 10 years. It was incredible.
What's helped you work with some of the best companies that are growing? What was it that you were doing that you think made you the special one?
There's a bunch of things that happened, but one of the biggest things that happened for me was when I was in my 20s, we had a corporate vice president at United Technologies who saw something in a 25-year-old kid and put me out in the field negotiating $4 billion jet engine contracts and gave me the carriage training. But he also sat down with me and he gave me a mindset and he gave me a vision, what I call the North Star vision, that I still am a advocate and is kind of the epicenter of all of my mentoring and advisory that I do. But he told me begin with the end in mind. And we sat and we mapped out a 25-year career on a piece of graph paper in the cafeteria one day. That was the kernel of what happened. And then as I went along in my journey, I'm a finance major. And one of the things that I did was, and Jerry Krause was the guy that told me, like, you're going to have to be able to check the boxes for treasury. So I worked in treasury. You're going to have to work IR. So I worked in IR. You're going to have to do a big accounting close. I did a $4 billion accounting close. I did a $4 billion financial consolidation of a never before done Motorola consolidation. I've done all of those things. It was hard. It stretched me to the ultimate, but it was all by design. I was very, very, very blessed that I went into all of this with the design in my mind. I knew what I was doing. So as I was going through each one of these things, I was looking at it like I'm just building the house. As I went to different companies and I could name different names, but at Dell, my boss was someone in my career that ended up being the CFO of Dell later. So, and he and I would work together very closely. He would give me insights into, hey, here's how you have to position things. Because the reality of it with numbers, and this is the funny part that I find with finance people, and why I think sometimes accountants have a hard time in the CFO seat, is numbers can tell any story. You can create anything you want with numbers. So what really needs to happen is you need to be able to take numbers and you need to tell a story with numbers. And you need to be right, by the way. Right? Because in order to do this at a high level, with companies that are growing 45, 50% a year, and then the last company we grew X in 5 years, whether it's advertising, whether it's tech, whether it's building, business is business at like a core level. So there are key tenets with all this. But what I would say is, if you can't get along with people as a CFO, you're highly unlikely to be successful. Highly unlikely. The other thing I would say is I hear a lot of people, especially controllers, that their de facto answer on any question is no, we can't do that. That again is not going to win you the CFO seat and it won't keep you in that seat because it's not about no, we can't do it. It's we can't do it this way, but there's 5 other ways we can do this. That's especially true with financing, with legal structures, with go to market. There's always an answer. It's just as as a CEO or a CRO, you know what the shiny object is. And as the CFO, if you can't distill that into multiple solutions and one that will actually work, because at the end of the day, a lot of times the C-suite is going to go that direction anyways. They're going to go do it.
I agree in terms of getting yourself a mentor. I was very blessed as well to have an ex-banker. So I like your analogy about moving functions because ultimately through that process, to your point, it's about the narrative as opposed to the numbers. But more importantly, what I found it's about is structures, how you structure things. So given that you've come from an internal function. Therefore, sometimes you are only working with the structure that you have. Yes, you can be creative, but normally you would bring in advisors and consultants who would put some advisory around that. Would some of your hunger and desire to learn about different structures and deal making influence through some of the partners opening your lens up to different ways of doing things? Sometimes you have to be in that environment of innovative thinking to be able to engineer different narratives.
It does. So a really good example of this, yeah, and it's easy for me to talk about Triad Retail Media. It's a company that no longer exists. Lots of reasons for that. But here's what I can say. For us in this unique environment, what happened was our biggest client was Walmart back in a day when buttons and banners on a retail website were a novel little idea. But then this little company came along called Amazon. And Amazon showed the world how advertising in the retail space can become a war chest, right? And the winning war chest. So our job got really easy as time went on, because when we used to call people early on in 2010, 2011, they didn't even understand. When we were calling a major retailer, they'd say, I don't understand. I'm not going to get in the way of my clients. I don't want this noise on my website. It went from that to the phone started ringing. We need you. And we did everything wrong. We expanded to probably 20 clients. This is after we won eBay. So our two biggest clients are Walmart, eBay, and understand these are enterprise level clients.
Are they over 50% of your revenue coming in?
Yeah.
As a CFO, I think I'd be worried about that, or an investor.
Yeah, but you know what? Here's what happened. We did the land and expand. But what made us excellent was these elite customers. And I would argue for anybody who watches this, if you want to be an excellent leader, if you want to be an excellent company, go after the hardest clients. Why? Because they are going to make you exceptional. Like, we had to get ISO compliant. We had to go through all these financial and accounting audits, and with a client like a Walmart or an eBay that you wouldn't necessarily have to do if you went for the long tail tier. But once you do that, it forces you to go upgrade your order management system. We did a failed Operative One implementation. It had nothing to do with their system. It had to do with the fact that we didn't understand what we wanted. So we spent a better part of a year really, really dialing into the operational requirements, used another solution, and it worked like a charm. But going back to it, you have to build, as the CFO, if you don't want to die from exhaustion across the whole company, you have to architect the backbone, the piping has to be done. So your best friend ends up being the technology and the accounting folks and the external third-party contracting firms that are going to help you implement these new software tools. But you must build an ERP. You must build the skeletal structure to hold this, because there's no other way. You can't grow from a few tens of millions of dollars to hundreds of millions of dollars, go from 2 offices to 12 offices like we did without a structure. It's impossible. You can't. Or you just have to hire so many people that the math wouldn't work on the bottom line. And oh, by the way, we did a lot of outsourcing. That was part of my role, was outsourcing and lowering costs through external parties. But the interesting thing about our company was, even though we had such a high concentration, what we found was the land and expand and going wide was too hard, because every one of these clients was like a snowflake and their requirements were totally different. And what we found was we were better off going deep and wide, what I call RAD, retention, acquisition, development, and developing these big clients, which is exactly what we did. So finding areas within their ecosystem to monetize for advertising. And it worked, because if you look at where Walmart is today with their advertising business, it's massive.
We're talking about scaling businesses quickly, and you spoke about going from, a couple of offices to about 12 different locations. What did you see that tends to break first during that growth phase?
We'll take one example. And what's interesting about this example, what does a board meeting look like in Fortune 50 company versus what does that same board meeting look like in we'll say maybe a company that's just that 9-figure threshold, maybe just before that. And somebody in that room wants to expand into Europe. could be Asia. But you've got this US business that's just absolute a beast, a monster, generating cash. Everything is healthy. People are doing really well. The ERP, the infrastructure is all working. And then somebody points to the little shiny object. Remember how I said in the beginning, I said, it tends to be not very emotional and very polite and choreographed. Well, take the antithesis of that now and go into a boardroom filled with, I want to do this. I want to do this. And you've got two private equity firms, you've got banks, you've got a small C staff. And now it's all about who's got the largest personality in the room and who's going to push the hardest on the passion side. And then there's the reality of this person is the reason this company is where it is. So how much bandwidth, how much loose rope are we going to give this person? And again, I'm using geographic expansion, but there's lots of other places this happens. Now, for example, if we're going to go into Europe, or if we're going to go into Asia, the problem with that is there's no such thing as Europe. There's no such thing as Asia as from a business standpoint. What do I mean by that? As the Europe is France, Germany. I could keep going. It's a group of things that are not interconnected, that are not common, that have different legal and financial rules and regulations. So when the leader says, let's just go to Europe, you as the finance person are like, now I've got to do 20 businesses, not one. Same thing's true with Asia, right? Because I've expanded into Asia. Singapore and Indonesia and Thailand and South Korea and China, every one of them is different. And that is a flaw, I think, that many companies have, even at the enterprise level, is they look at it and they go, oh, there's a geography. We need to go win the map in that geography. And as a CFO, to anybody listening who's never done this before, when somebody says, let's just expand into a geography, and Latin America is another perfect one. You're going after 20 businesses. It's not one, you're going after 20. And your whole ecosystem that you've built for the United States, as an example, or it could be Britain in your case, it's not going to work anywhere else. And the culture won't work anywhere else. And everything that worked in America or in London isn't working over there. And it parlays all the way to me being in Zambia, because Zambia is probably the most extreme example, because what does not work here is this Western aggression, like we're just going to push our way through. It doesn't work. It's tribal. I'm working on really big projects. You have to be patient. You have to sit back and you have to allow the people that are supposed to be the decision makers to make the decision through influence, which is very common, right, in the Middle East, even at the enterprise level. So what am I saying? I'm saying that there's an interpersonal skill required to be a CFO, a successful CFO, one that actually makes the numbers, hits the board, and isn't absolutely despised by everybody on the staff, is not despised, right? It's say that the CFO is probably the hardest job in the world. I really believe it's probably one of the hardest jobs on planet Earth. And I don't know what the tenure is. You probably know. What's the average tenure?
Now it's 3 years. It used to be much longer. It's probably getting shorter.
Yeah, and I did 655, and there are lots of reasons for that. But a lot of it has to do with what we're saying right now. And then you think about, I know you're really deep into like the different financial channels and the different ways of funding and acquiring. But when you start to talk about, acquisition now, and when I was at Triad at the end, we were looking at acquiring a company, had to happen to be a technology company outside of the US. As a CFO, you now become best friends with your lawyers, right? And you have to learn a whole new language, not phonetically, but legally and structurally. You have to learn a whole new language, and you have to do it really, really fast because the business is moving towards something. And I found that to be one of the bigger challenges. It's one thing to build a company from scratch when you've done it before. It's another one to learn all the nuances of a market that you know nothing about, really. And then you find out, no, never mind. We're not going there. We're going in that direction.
When you are looking at the expansion plan, when you're having those high stake conversations, what tends to create the most tension? How do you pick your fights?
When we were, When I first started at Triad Retail Media, it was venture capital. By the end of 2012, so less than 2 years later, we sold to private equity, happened to be Rockbridge Growth. And it was an amazing outcome for everybody. The business was cranking.
The VC came in. Did you already know the time frame, or was it a market dynamic shift?
When I was hired by VC to become the founding CFO, it was absolutely with the intention of fortifying all of the structures and the accounting and all of that for a sale. Yes.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
that timeline realistically was around 5 to 7 years.
Okay.
So what happened was 2 years later, we were on the block. Why? Because the market dynamic changed dramatically, because retail media became this kind of almost like indie hippie thing to mainstream enterprise. If you're a retailer, you must play in this space. And that's even true today, and it won't stop. We far exceeded any timeline, any outcome expectation with that. Okay. So we decided the reason that we went out to sale was we decided that we wanted to expand even faster. And you know this. We were bought by a VC that had a very specific budget, if you will, and wherewithal. And so they were like, hey guys, God bless you, but we're the wrong partner. And this is normal, right? So then what happened was private equity. It wasn't just private equity though. We went through a process, and at one time there were double-digit interest from different parties. Private equity was one, Strat was another. For us and what we wanted to do, this particular private equity was the best answer for us at that time. So the first meeting that we ever had post-acquisition was our 5-year exit plan. That was the first meeting we ever had. And it was brilliant, by the way.
I love that. I always say more businesses need to think like private equity structures. I really do. When you were talking about you took that role, I was thinking, what's the exit?
Yeah. Right. With this particular private equity, and it's no secret, it was Rockbridge Growth Equity, right? Which is Dan Gilbert's. The first meeting we ever had was to talk about the exit. And then we went out and got some market expertise and a study done and figured out where we were going to aim. And we did all that. Where it got interesting was as we're now growing, like I told you, we're growing 9 figures a year. We're growing like $120 million a year in top line. And by the way, scaling. But as we're all looking out over the landscape, and ad tech is becoming much more complicated by the minute. Remnant becomes real-time bidding. None of this existed in 2010. So as the market is getting SSPs and DSPs and all these things, we all started saying to ourselves in the boardroom, and our board meetings were fantastic, by the way. They were 30 minutes of kind of tactical stuff, and then we'd spend the next 2 hours on like, what's our big strategy? And so I'll give a lot of credit there. But then we started looking at acquisition.
Did you have the PE firms joining your board meetings?
Absolutely. Yeah, we had weekly calls with our PE, and then we had our board meetings monthly, and then we had a big quarterly. Here's where it gets interesting. There were acquisitions that we could have done easily because we had our own cash and we had lines of credit. So we could have done those. But when you start going for the grand slam acquisition, now you have to go out and do debt financing. And what does that mean to the people in the room, to the private equity guy, to the founder's CEO, to the people that are all holding equity? It's real easy until the throat tightens and you're like, oh, wait, that means I got to take a haircut. And that's really where it gets interesting. So the numbers do their job. And you do your synergy analysis as the CFO, and here's what all the numbers look like, guys. There's still this pause. There's still this like, wow, we're gonna have to go from a company that has no cash concerns whatsoever. We are now contemplating living in a different world where the bank covenants now, it's not the original debt financing. So it's a whole nother game. We ultimately did not, in my time, we did not do the acquisition after a lot of hand-wringing for well over 9 months. We did not pull the trigger. Was that a good move or a bad move? I don't know. Part of the reason why Triad Retail Media doesn't exist anymore is because it was a sales and marketing layer without any tech. That's the truth. So it was all third-party, begged, borrowed, and stolen. And so we knew that strategically the right answer was to go have some owned tech. That never happened. And that's not 100% sure, but I won't get into the nuance of that because there was another acquisition after my time by a big holding company that did have some tech, but it wasn't enough to defend the turf.
It gets me thinking, do risk attitudes change consciously, or do you see a behavior shift before the strategy changes? Did that risk profile change from the moment you had that very first board meeting?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yes, because I would say it's very healthy, by the way. It's really healthy because I work with a lot of founders now and I work with boards and I'm in the middle of one right now. And if you don't have clarity around why you're doing what you're doing and what the ultimate goal is, it muddies the water too much too often, even when it comes to capital decisions, right? It's like, well, why are we doing this? So one of my first questions going all the way back to the Alienware days when Alienware was by decree and by all the documents was a standalone company, my first question was, so what's the 3-year plan? And just like when you ask somebody, what do you want? When you go into a company, often nobody can answer the question, what do I want? Like really answer that question. Most companies will say, oh, yeah, we have a plan. I'm like, show me. The answer is no, you don't. No, you don't. And there's a difference between going back to 2007 to today. That's my MO. It's like, what's the plan? And if somebody says, oh, well, it's no, like, what's the plan? And then there's a difference between numbers on a spreadsheet and then show me the operational and the go to market and the strategy plan. And where the magic happens is when you've got it on an Excel spreadsheet and you have it operationalized with KPIs and EOS and whatever you use, and you've broken it down into here's what we're doing this week, this month, this quarter. And that we did that very, very mindfully with Rockbridge, with Triad. And the cool part is we had everything at the time, one Excel spreadsheet, housed every strategic achievement that we needed for the year. And that's all we needed. And that's what we talked about. One thing that happened in that very simple process that was complex, if that makes sense, where we laid out what is it that we're going to do for the, here's what the next 12 months looks like by quarter, was we divvied up ownership. And that's probably one of the biggest things that I've found. And this goes all the way back to the beginning. One of the things that happens when you implement this idea of an exit plan or a real, true multi-year plan that's operational is it gets ownership for each element of it. And then there's accountability. And whichever tools that you use kind of becomes irrelevant. It's the accountability piece and the tracking of it, right? And as the CFO, you're the one that owns the things that have numbers on them, right? But it ends up being a very powerful kind of lubricant and fuel for an exceptional executive team. Because until you get that, you get people that tend to work in their own little silos and they don't really worry too much about what the other person is doing. It's when you've got that glue, you become that kind of, SEAL team or whatever analogy you want to use, because everybody's rowing in the same direction and it's visible, right? And so if somebody fumbles the ball, one thing you can do is I'll point at that person that fumbled the ball. But in reality, because everybody sees the prize and what they want to get out of this effort, people will come and help. And that doesn't mean that people survive. What it means is that people will help. And if it's too much help too often, then it means somebody's in the wrong seat. And you fix that. Everybody's got a sharp pencil when you're projecting something. The lead becomes duller as you go along and it's not working. As a CFO, for sure. One of the skills that you have to acquire as quickly as you can is prioritization, because there's 9 million things happening at any given time, especially when you're growing like we were and building the plane as we were flying it, as we used to all say. And it was true. And look, Dell was the same way. Dell grew. At the time, was the fastest growing company on planet Earth, and I got there towards the tail end of that hyper growth, but it still grew. So the best you can do is lay out your projections with as much detail and rigor as you can. But I was probably blessed in my career that I worked at a company like Motorola, which was a special company, Six Sigma, and you learn the rules about Six Sigma, which is the 80-20 rule and so on and so forth. So if you spend your time on the right levers and you learn those levers, that's how I've always been. So I'm a very operational person. I've never been the person who just puts a bunch of numbers on a piece of paper and then kind of goes off into my suite and goes and studies the next set of numbers. I was always testing them. Me and a very trusted and amazing partner did every lease that we that we had with the company. So I was like, wasn't like my fingernails were dirty. It was like all the way up to my shoulders in a measured way. I figured out, where is it going to matter? And that's a hard thing to learn, and you're not always right. And the numbers are always not right, and the projections are not right. But if you're honest with the numbers, this is like I said, where you can tell any story you want with the numbers, but if you're honest with the numbers, if you're a leader and you're a CFO, you have to be willing to say, this is not working. This is not working. And I've done that at the highest levels you can possibly do it at. And this is not working. And let me show you why. Let me show you why. Here's the numbers. Here's why it's not working.
Can you give one or two examples on that, Chris?
One of the easy examples was when we found ourselves growing really rapidly. Like all of a sudden we're growing and we've got two major clients. And you said it way in the beginning, that concentration risk must have drove you crazy. So I'm like, I'm going to go fix that. We're going to go acquire, 20, 30 clients. And we did. And it was a disaster. I think, this is an opinion, I think it would have ruined our company. I think we would not have been able to handle it. I think the weight of that was way too much. And I wasn't the only one, but I was one of the people that said, this is not working. And walking into the boardroom and saying, we got to change our strategy. This is not sustainable. We didn't think of this, this, and this when we did our numbers. And it was down to brass tacks of, this is how this partner does business. And here are the system interfaces that we have to work on. It's going to take us 3 to 6 months with a team of people we don't have right now. And that's just one client. And we've got 15 more. And so when you look at this, it doesn't work. And so we all collectively looked at the numbers, looked at the strategy, and we redirected.
Was the problem the strategy, or was the problem the structure, having the right people, the right organizational design to be able to deliver that? Or do you think it was more broader than that?
It was a little bit of both, and probably more about, it wasn't that we couldn't have done it. It was as though, you know what it would be? It would be like I'm a car guy, right? So it'd be like you're this weekend racer and you got your nice sports car, and now you're going to go try to compete in Formula One, and you don't have the engine, you don't have the staff, you don't have the pit crew, you don't have anything. What would it take for you to take your weekend racer and put it on F1 track? The answer is, it would take a massive amount of investment, a massive amount of learning, fill in all the blanks. And we just decided that, and at the end of the day, though, the biggest issue, I think, was we probably could have done it and we could have made that bet and funded that bet, but there was no guarantee that that was going to pay off. Whereas we knew, with almost not absolute certainty, but with a very, very high degree of certainty, we knew that if we just kept true to our current big clients and we went deep with them, that the business would grow exponentially. We were pretty certain of that. And we tested it, by the way, with them. We did. We tested it with them and said, hey, here's what we're thinking with the strategy. And as it turns out, they were totally on board with that. So it wasn't a flashpoint decision. It was a process-driven, customer engagement model-driven period, but it went very quickly. Within 90 days, we redirected, and it took us some time, obviously, to kind of decouple some agreements that we'd had. So it probably ended up running 9 months or so, but it was a great learning that served me many times over.
So if you were advising another CFO or a CEO making a major decision today under the certainty of everything that's going on in the world at the moment, through your career and your own learning insights, if you would rank the top 5 things that you would really want them to understand in terms of how decisions behave in practice.
But clearly one of the first things is, do you have the wherewithal with cash or cash funding access to even contemplate what you're considering? Because the third company, or I guess the fourth company that I helped grow was Playwire. And in that company, we had to answer a whole different set of questions early on, which is, how do we get cash flow working? How do we get profitability working? So it depends where you are. The first thing is, I would say, take an honest assessment of where you are: liquidity, profitability, growth, product, IP. Those are the things that fly into my brain. And then the big one, culture. So it's one thing to say that we want to be a championship level contender in a space. it's another. So if you have the cash, if you're profitable, if you've got the product, if you have line of sight to a TAM where you can actually play in the game, and you have the product, or you have at least the product vision that you can navigate to. If you've got all those things and you don't have the org and the culture, who are you kidding? How are you going to? And that therein lies the golden nugget for every big leader, I think, is, you look at these companies that have been around or that are developing now, Anthropic, and you can look at Dell is near and dear to my heart. So Dell has an amazing culture. Motorola probably had one of the best cultures I've ever experienced. And I've been part of companies that didn't have a culture when I got there, and you have to build that. It takes a minute to build a culture. You can go find cash, you can go get investors, right? And with that cash, you can build cool things. And if you're doing it mindfully, you can go after a TAM and a SOM that makes sense. So you can navigate there. And if you do all those things, you can grow and you can stay liquid. But do you have the culture and the people that are going to hold that vessel? And if the answer is no, there's no magic sauce maybe there's an answer that somebody else has found. I've heard quite a number of leaders and have been around leaders that have said, oh, it's just the model. We can do this. Don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. I've never seen that play itself out. You have to have an aligned set of people, and I call it, I'm a car guy, right? You have to build the chassis, but you have to this thing needs to be architected. You need to mindfully build all the pieces, and the culture piece oftentimes is the longest pole in the tent, oftentimes.
A lot of people talk about culture, and in some environments, you could say it's almost like a buzzword. Um, makes billions of pounds of revenue just talking about culture. Just think about the amount of consultancy strategy work that goes behind that as well. What, in your view, when you talk about culture, what are we actually talking about?
It's a great question. And it comes down to this. When you think of any elite organization that you can think of, whether it's a sports team, whether it's a racing team, whether it's a company, and what culture is it's a thread that aligns everybody to a common purpose in doing it in the right way. So it's not buzzwords. It's not the 5 little like banners on the wall. What it is not all for one and one for all, because that doesn't probably work in most cases. What it is it's this kind of passion towards a vision that's united across a team. Think of, this is a bit of an extreme example, but I think it's a perfect one, which is, think of an elite military unit, and that elite military unit has to perform flawlessly. And so the person over on the left has to do exactly what they need to do when they need to do it, and the person on the right needs to do. That's culture. That's what culture is. So culture is directly tied to performance, and it's how do we perform at an elite level. And you see it very readily in sports, and I've been a coach for young girls and teenage girls soccer because my girls played, and that's where you learn the guts of culture. And culture isn't yay rah rah. Culture is, this is how we play, this is how we support one another, this is how we function when all these different things happen, and this is how we win. That's culture.
When you look at where we are right now, AI has gone into the mainstream retail market. We're starting to see AI automation and fast flow of information. What happens to financial decisions in that type of ecosystem? And what part of a CFO role starts to disappear first, in your view?
I'm really excited about what AI is going to do. If I look back on my career, and now this is the part where I show myself to be a dinosaur, we were doing $4 billion jet engine military proposals on Lotus 123 with 52 KB floppy disks to build a menu driven. And we would do reconciliations with 4-foot high stacks of paper that dated back 3 years. And the only way you could do anything was with a piece of paper and manually going through massive amounts of data. And what's my point? My point is, you spent all of your time just trying to get through the data, hoping you'd have a minute of analysis. I remember at Motorola, we had a vision to do a 1-day close. It was taking almost 3 weeks. We got there. That was Fox Pro, and that was manhandling DOS prompts. Fast forward to Lotus Excel and macro tables and things like that. It got faster. So what's my point? My point is, in my career, we would spend, if we had if 100 is the measurement, we would spend 90 to 95 getting to the data. So if you had an investor relation call on Workday plus, you probably were getting data like around Workday +7, maybe Workday +10, sometimes Workday +12. So in the AI era, I'm going to hope that Workday 0, you've got all your data. Instead of having a room full of people, which I did, doing all the accounting, and you had analysts waiting for data so they could do their mind work, I would hope that that would flip itself on its head. So now analysts can do more analytical work, or what if this? More forward looking. So I think that's where the world is headed, because I use AI every day. I use Claude this morning. I use Gemini at the same time. To me, it's exciting. I know a lot of people are nervous because they feel like jobs are going to go away. I think certain jobs will go away. I mean, the people that were cleaning up horse manure on the street lost jobs, like when the car came around, and that's a horrible example, but it's a real one, right? There are jobs that will go away, but I'm very optimistic that there's going to be better jobs. And what's going to be needed is, again, I go back to this word architects. You're going to need people that sit between the business, right, and the people. And they're going to need to make sure that AI knows exactly what to do. Maybe AI someday will be at a level where that's not needed, but I still think that's not true. And I still think human beings are going to be the ones that point the way. And in that whole process, I think we're going to, as a CFO, I think a CFO's job, frankly, will get a lot easier in the AI era than it was in the past, because a CFO is going to have more real-time data. And if a CFO wants 20 data points, no problem. Whereas in the past, you probably had to make decisions as a CFO. I know I did with 0.25% of the data, and you had to go on instinct, experience, the best third-party data you can get. So I'll stop it there, but that's my thoughts about AI.
So what we're saying is the processing power of being able to process, and also from an analytical perspective, do you think finance CFOs will trust the data that's been presented to them?
It goes back to whether the data is architected by you or not. Today, that CFO has to trust the data anyways, somewhere along the way, and has to design that data, right, to the best of his or her ability. So that doesn't change. So what that means is that is a CFO going to, if I go back to 10, 15 years ago, when I was in the ad tech space, I had 10, 20 data scientists that were playing around with data algorithms to make the best analytical decision on an impression and a delivery of an ad. You don't need them anymore. Now you just need AI to do that. Can I trust AI unequivocally? The answer is no. But you never could, though. You never could. And that's the point, is that as a CFO, as a new technologist, like a CTO or a CIO, you're going to have to be partners in developing that architecture that gives you the answers or answer that you feel comfortable with. Is it always going to be right? It never is. Never has been. Probably never will be.
I was having a conversation, financial service business, and the use of AI. They're in development stage at the moment, but within about a year or so, they will be taking out 700 jobs. It got me wondering, as a CFO, how am I starting to see the landscape of what my finance function's going to look like in the next 12 to 24 months, especially when we've got cost pressures and I'm distributing it across the business. As a CFO, how am I thinking about my own function? How would I be starting to map some of that out going into a boardroom conversation right now?
You know what? If you're really objective about it and forgetting about this AI term, which to me is just it's supercomputing, right? What's the difference between that as a CFO and outsourcing? Because I've done massive amounts of outsourcing to lower cost in my prior lives across multiple companies, whether it be manufacturing, whether it be data reporting, whether it be batch processing of certain marketing functions. What's the difference? I think it comes down to, from an internal perspective as a CFO, if we talk about that for a minute, I just think the componentry of what your staff does is going to be very different. Anybody today, so when you think about people grinding through accounts payable, accounts receivable, a lot of accounting work to get to numbers that takes days, weeks, sometimes months, those functions will be very much, the heavy load will be carried by AI with humans kind of architecting and overseeing. So I think the makeup of your staff is going to be very different, and you're going to have more analytics and you're going to have more kind of forward looking human people involved. Will there be fewer net? I don't know. I think what will happen is I think we're going to create jobs that never existed. And we could go back to examples in history where, when a new step function technology comes along, jobs are created that nobody even thought about and didn't know about. I do think that will happen. But when you think about the external side of this, there's a lot of uncertainty. Like I can't sit here and pretend that there's no uncertainty, but I will also say that we're going to have more information. So if you're a CFO, one thing that's almost guaranteed is you're going to have much more information than you used to have. You're going to be able to get more real-time information, sometimes instant information that you couldn't have dreamed of having even a year ago, right? So, yeah, and I could give you examples of clients of mine that are able to pull data, overnight or in a few days that would take 3 months and they would never have bandwidth for. So, as a CFO, I actually think the job is going to get easier, not harder. I think there'll be more information. The challenge will be figuring out which information do I trust and why do I trust this information, and whether that be the external market, whether that be internal. It's kind of irrelevant in a way because there's going to be data everywhere. It's going to be omnipotent. Everywhere you look, there's going to be data. Whereas in my day, if I go back 20 years ago, getting one data point sometimes was a gift. Now you're going to probably have 50 or 100 data points. So I view that as bounty, I don't view it as scarcity. I'm coming at it from another angle, which is we're going into an era of abundance as a CFO because I'm going to have more, not less. And I think that's a good thing for the profession and for the title and for the role, because I think there are too many CFOs, not even by choice, but more by dictate, are so buried in just trying to get to, for example, like an IR session and having all of the information I'm going to need for that and the right storyline. As one example, those things will get easier. And I do think with the abundance of water flow and the velocity of that water flow, it's going to be more incumbent upon people like the CFO, among others, to really fortify the pipes and make sure the water is going in the right places at the right time, with the right controls, with the right quality. So we're in an era of hyperspeed, I think, we're already there and it's coming even more rapidly today. That's where we're at.
Brilliant. Chris, I've thoroughly enjoyed having this conversation with you. If anyone wants to connect with you, I will attach your LinkedIn profile. With that said, thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to catch up with you soon.